Arthur Smith's Falcons played the quarterbackless New York Jets. That is not what we're going to be talking about as we review Week 13 here on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter, Stealing Signals, at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, an interesting week. You know, we had some high-scoring affairs. The Chargers beat the Patriots 6-0. We had, the Falcons and the Jets playing to a 13-8 game that was, was 2-0 after one quarter. We saw Joe Flacco come back. You were just talking to me about this before we went live, and looked way better than he had any reason to. You said it kind of made Tom Brady's comments look, a little bit accurate because he's from that older era and comes back and just sort of immediately looks competent.
He was standing back there, statuesque. Partly it's that Joe Flacco really doesn't care. He's got the Beyond Honey Badger thing going, so you can't pressure him because he couldn't possibly care less what's going to happen on that play. But, the cool that he was exuding as his not particularly talented Cleveland Browns receivers are running all over the place. And then he's just hitting them in stride like it's nothing. We switched from the Rams. Well, we switched from the Browns defense to the Rams defense at the last minute, and it did end up being a 9-0 difference. So that was great. And yet, as I was watching the game, mostly I'm like, the Rams are not getting anywhere near Joe Flacco, nor is he throwing interceptable passes. Because he's actually being an NFL quarterback and throwing the ball across the line of scrimmage, which the current generation of quarterbacks simply will not do. He's it's not that hard. It's and there will be no age that I get that I won't be able to throw the ball 60 yards in the air easily, which does at least mean you got to respect and mildly defend the deep passes. I've never had any accuracy on that pass, but I can throw it that far.
The interception he threw today was so funny. It was just, it was just like an arm punt. I don't know. Did he not see the safety? He just threw it out.
It's the game is not in doubt anymore. I'm going to really toss this one up.
It was not even like a Ryan Fitzpatrick pick. It was even more YOLO than Ryan Fitzpatrick. It became a punt. You are being kind saying we made a defense switch. I spent the morning trying to figure out where my Washington Huskies would be playing in the college football playoff semifinals. Obviously, I'm stoked that they won Friday night over Oregon and made it there. But then I didn't really like that they were playing in New Orleans and that Florida State got left out and some other things. And so I spent the hour leading up to the kickoff arguing with people online about college football. Thought our lineups were mostly set. And then I saw the email from you, and you had sent me a text as well that you wanted to talk through some defense and kicker start and sits, and apparently you smashed them all because you also got the Chargers defense in one league, and they had that shutout, just stealing edges, Shawn, with the defensive starts.
Well, Ben,
that's up to you. It wasn't us. It was you.
After I spent Wednesday night bidding on defenses and kickers, I'm I'm going to get them in there. I don't want to have wasted all that time.
Oh, that's fantastic. The Flacco thing was so funny because I felt the same way. He actually looked competent. He was able to, he ends up throwing 44 passes in this game, doesn't complete a whole ton of them, 23.
Then Elijah Moore caught some passes. You might have forgotten that he was still in the NFL.
I did. Yeah, 12 targets, 4 catches. So it only took, 3 times as many targets to get him. But no, 83 yards receiving. He has a decent little game. For me, and I just referenced that Jets-Falcons game, I've been so tilted about the Jets' unwillingness to actually try anything reasonable at quarterback. Obviously, we've talked about how when they go to Tim Boyle, he's worse than Zach Wilson. We had a laugh last week or a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, about Tim Boyle's college production and his overall profile. And just, it's so ridiculous. We got Trevor Siemian in this game for the Jets. I've never thought Trevor Siemian was good at all, but I had been saying early on when they signed him to the practice squad, they should at least activate him and get a look at him and see if he's decent, because he had mild moments in Denver that made me think he could potentially be competent in this offense. But the point is, the bar was so low with the other two guys you had rostered, Zach Wilson and Tim Boyle. You needed to jump over them and see Simeon. And then if Simeon didn't work, you needed to move on and continue iterating and continue until something worked, like what Joe Flacco did today.
Is just, conspiracy theory wise, the Jets trying to protect Aaron Rodgers from himself, because they're like, if we win any games, he's going to insist on coming back. The only way to make sure that he's healthy for next year is if we play Tim Boyle. Then how are the Jets and the Patriots not switching quarterbacks every possession?
Oh no, I mean they should be, but the maddening thing, I'm doing.
Where's
this so
Will
long, Greer? The maddening thing for the Joe Flacco day today is the whole point I tried to make all year in Silly Signals and on Twitter and on this show was that they needed to be iterating, they needed to be trying different quarterbacks and being also willing to quickly move on, but embracing uncertainty, embracing chaos, the YOLO QB strategy. We talked a lot about this. And part of the issue was like, well, you're not going to just find the next Josh Dobbs, this guy who's immediately competent, and you should give a little bit of a longer leash to and see what's going to happen. And that's not to say Dobbs is perfect, but Dobbs did enough in his quick because he got acquired right before week 1 for the Cardinals, and his quick turnaround there that they kept running with him in Arizona. And then same deal in Minnesota. After they acquired him, he had a great couple of first outings, obviously struggled in his next outing. We don't even know if he's going to be playing coming out of the bye. But the big counterpoint was not everyone can be Josh Dobbs. The Joe Flacco game in Cleveland is so tilted because he was the first one that everyone was saying, I'm pretty sure you mentioned in one of our early shows, that the Jets should go to. They had him on the roster last year. He threw passes to Garrett Wilson a year ago. Like, why wouldn't they go get him? That was the obvious answer. Bring back Flacco. Flacco wanted to play, apparently, because he's back with the Browns now. Why did they not try out Joe Flacco in September, Sean? I mean, what would their record be right now?
Undefeated. I mean, they won the first game with Zach Wilson. That was the point at which they were 1-0 and could have gone on a run. No, I mean, the other thing here is it does remind you that there are a lot of guys like vaguely out there who seem to be too old. But if you're like mid to late 30s and or even early 40s, and you didn't suffer a serious shoulder injury, which a lot of these guys, you are leaving the NFL once the injuries have become too much. You have this kind of sad story recently about Drew Brees, for example. But I mean, I can serve bigger now than I could as a college tennis player. I mean, your arm will still do the things that you need. And like Tom Brady was saying, if you can read and execute a defense, then execute against a defense. I mean, you can bring things to the table that a lot of these teams need. I mean, you're not going to be Josh Allen. You're not going to be Jalen Hurts, even though he struggled massively today. You're not going to be Patrick Mahomes, even though he struggled significantly again today. But you're going to be able to move some of these offenses. And, another fantastic performance from Matthew Stafford, who's kind of in that same basic situation where he's actually had multiple, fairly serious hand, arm, elbow, shoulder-ish injuries. And yet anytime that he's healthy and has his guys, I mean, the Rams have been a very strange team this year, but they're back hot again. And I mean, Matthew Stafford annihilated the Cleveland Browns elite defense today.
Yeah, he looked good. Puka Nacua looked good. Sean, you just mentioned Drew Brees' injury, and that reminded me of something that you probably didn't get to see because you're not on Twitter. But Michael Thomas, who is on IR and not at the game, decided to tweet about his team quite a bit today. And one of the things he had to say about his quarterback was, when your eyes don't work, you get people hurt. It's no mystery, and it's something that needs to be studied. He tweeted that. Now, to be clear, he didn't actually name that he was talking about Derek Carr, but he was tweeting about the team otherwise and liking tweets and things. And anyway, you brought up Brees, and I had this funny moment today with Michael Thomas where I was like, he has hated every other quarterback he's played with since Drew Brees. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I mean, Drew Brees was pretty decent. And Sean
I think he just realized that I think he got spoiled a little bit early in his career with Drew Brees.
Well, Derek Carr averaged over 10 yards per attempt today. and only threw 1 pick, only took 2 sacks. I mean, there are going to be some games where maybe you create some yardage, but you have a lot of negative plays. Not really. I mean, Derek Carr has had a fantastic season. And Michael Thomas has not done a lot of things to endear himself to his team or his teammates for a long time now.
That is true. There's a lot of people on Twitter that would not agree with you that Derek Carr's had a great, or at least, I mean, they're clamoring, Sean, out in these streets for Jameis Winston because he has thrown to Chris Olave a little bit of a higher rate, and on the 40 or 50 passes that he's thrown this year, and so we want Jameis Winston for Olave is the current take. He did hit him for a long gain in this one. It was off a defender's hands, nearly intercepted. The announcer goes, "The full Jameis experience," gleefully. And I mean, it was a good call. That's the way I would have called it.
I mean, there's maybe a little too much glee there. I mean, it's supposed to be on silly podcast, not like on the national telecast.
Right.
But yeah, you did get that. I mean, he missed Olave open on the last 2 plays, which was unfortunate if you are a Saints fan and your team, despite not being particularly good, is probably far and away the best team actually in the NFC South.
Yeah, or if you're an anti-Arthur Smith fan and you want the Saints to win because no one else can win the division.
Then this is a horrible game by the Detroit Lions a week after they were embarrassed on Thanksgiving. Now, one of the things that we're seeing is that the Green Bay Packers are very much for real, and that Jordan Love has taken a massive step forward kind of in the middle of the season, right after, more or less the GM's like, I don't know if he's the guy. But in this game, the Lions get up 21-0 early, and they spend the entire rest of the contest trying to give it away. They have 30 rushing attempts, only 25 passes, even though Sam LaPorta is, schooling the Saints defense every single time that he gets a target. Catches all 9 today for 140 yards and a touchdown. He is open at will. You have Jahmyr Gibbs, who averages over 7 yards per attempt, but the Lions don't seem fit to get him the ball, either as a rusher or a receiver. It's time that we shelve the David Montgomery into the middle experiment and stop trying to prove to people that we're so tough. Stop trying to take last week's game plan where the Saints struggled to stop the run and say, oh, they struggled to stop the run last week. We're going to try and shove it down their throats. Ben Johnson is the lead candidate for that Carolina Panthers job if he wants it. You have got to do a better job than he did today. If the Lions give this game away, they step right back into the midst of an NFC North battle for the division. And this team is far, far, far too talented to do that. And after a month where Jahmyr Gibbs was a star and they deserved a lot of credit for unleashing him, how can you be back in this situation that we're in today where you almost lose the game and you're not using your playmakers? One of the things here that's kind of amusing is that they can't get the ball to Jamison Williams in the passing game, but when you toss it to him, he's like, everybody else is in slow motion compared to me. You have Jamison Williams, you have Jahmyr Gibbs, you have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who only catches 2 passes, and you have the new superstar tight end. Then we were kind of joking, and I kind of went back and forth. I did a little update just in my kind of Monday article a couple weeks later because I'd had so much fun with you. I told you that LaPorta and McBride were kind of on that 2-3 turn. They have responded to me barely leaving them out by just going full peak Travis Kelce. These 2 guys are going to be unstoppable for a decade.
Yeah, they look incredible. The Lions, 4 3-and-outs today. 3 of them, David Montgomery touched on 1st and 10. And an unsuccessful play.
And again,
so yeah,
you have a limited number of possessions in the game.
Yep, it's a game. Football is a game of possessions. 2 of those 3-and-outs came in the first half. They had also a 4-and-out, got a first down on a David Montgomery run, and then a 3-and-out right behind it. which included a 2nd and 10 David Montgomery run for 3 yards. 2nd and 10 runs, I believe statistically the worst play call in football in terms of the potential. Because like the difference between 3rd and 10 on an incompletion and 3rd and 7 when you go get a David Montgomery 3-yard run on 2nd and 10, the conversion rates are like not that different. So you might as well use the 2nd and 10 to try to convert a first down as opposed to gaining 3 yards and just making the 3rd down a 3rd and long, slightly less long. But anyway, in the first half, what I was going to say is their other drives were all touchdowns and a field goal, and then 2 3-and-outs and that 4-and-out. Second half, they have a field goal, a touchdown, and the 2 3-and-outs, and then their drive to end the game. It's a game of possessions. They win this game 33-28. Every other drive was a scoring drive other than those punt drives I was discussing. And to your point, they get up 21-0 at the end of the first quarter. They're up 24-7 at half. And this game comes down to a situation where the Saints have the ball down 5 late and have an opportunity to win the game.
Yeah, I mean, the Saints came roaring back. Excellent work by them. Derek Carr had a bad start. Then he was fantastic in the middle. You have another nice effort from Taysom Hill, who rushes for 59 yards and a touchdown. You have Jameis Winston come in and does complete some passes to Chris Olave. Olave not a factor as they go down 21-0. Obviously, coming off of that concussion, you're a little bit worried that he might not be at 100%, and then spends the middle to, you could argue, the entire rest of the game just scorching the Detroit Lions secondary. Unfortunately, they didn't really have any complementary pieces. A.T. Perry, kind of the next guy up. He takes the 3 targets today, but not really involved. The Saints are one of these teams that, watching every game every week, they're not amazing by any stretch, but a very solid team. And it's kind of the flip side of the Pittsburgh Steelers, where the Steelers, I think, very much emphasized again today that they do have the good leadership. They do have a quarterback who hasn't made a lot of mistakes, even as he doesn't move the ball. We saw exactly why Mitchell Trubisky is the backup in this game, because he's still far worse than Kenny Pickett. And yet, I mean, the Pittsburgh Steelers are not a good team. They were just manhandled by Arizona today at home.
The first drive that Trubisky came in for to start the second half, or not the first drive, but one of the, well, I mean, I think that Pickett got hurt like right before the half, and I think it was essentially Trubisky took over after the half. Are you saying that when you're in the shotgun, an inability to catch the snap, would you say that's a good thing or a bad thing?
The thing that is so frustrating with the Steelers is that you see George Pickens make a few plays today. I mean, obviously he's still not successfully drawing targets at the rate that you need to be the kind of player that he thinks that he is and that we wish that he were. You have a step back from Freiermuth, who's not able to build on his momentum. You get Deontay Johnson, not really deployed today, though he does get the touchdown to mildly save his fantasy day. Another game, similar to what we had with the Lions, where, Najee Harris plays a really good game last week. And Ben Harris has some really good peripherals, has done some nice things this season. But this game here where he gets the 16 carries, it's just, this team isn't put together to be anything more than a team that gets lucky and wins. And anytime that you have a starting quarterback who's not particularly dynamic and has left a lot on the field this year, and you do get a backup who has a strong arm and has a lot of experience, I mean, you certainly wouldn't want the starter to get hurt. You don't necessarily think the backup's better, but you're thinking a little bit that along the Jameis Winston and Joe Flacco lines, like maybe there can be a spark here. I mean, the Steelers do score and do have a missed field goal in the second half, but you really would like to see more dynamism from Trubisky at this point. It seemed like he could spark them against a team as bad as the Arizona Cardinals. That did not happen.
They trailed throughout the game, and certainly the second half. Trubisky threw 17 passes. They have 27 passes in the game, 31 rushes. You mentioned kind of like the Lions situation. different in that the Lions were at least leading when they decided to run more than they passed. The Steelers decided that 16 Najee Harris carries against 27 total passes, and they went up with the 31 rushes, as I mentioned. And Jaylen Warren only gets 9 of those. He goes for 59 yards on his 9, 4 yards fewer than Harris on one more than half as many carries, 9 compared to 16 carries. But yeah, you mentioned Frymington building the momentum. Not a lot there for Pickens, not a lot for Deontay, in part because there's 27 passes. Those guys all tie for the team lead with 5 targets. You do wish that they could consolidate the volume, like maybe a little bit more than that. Allen Robinson gets 3 targets. Why is he getting 3? I mean, 3. He catches them all for 19 yards. I don't know what the point of that is. You have Connor Hayward mixing in and getting a couple targets, and Calvin Austin getting one. And in a low-volume game, probably too much ancillary target usage for the main guys. But also the issue is just they didn't trust them and the quarterbacks and didn't throw the ball enough against an Arizona team that you can throw on. But they go out and win here. The Patriots lose again, so now the Patriots are in the number 2 seed. Sean, everyone's saying that Belichick's going to get fired. I think he's sly like a fox. I think he's going to wind up with one of the top 2 quarterbacks.
So that's why we're not getting the Will Greer action.
That's right. They don't want to win. Yeah, no. They're doing everything they can possibly do to lose games, and they're good at it. They're showing they've lost their last 3 games 10-6, 10-7, and 6-0. They're like, even though you guys are terrible teams who can't score, we're still going to find a way to score less. I mean, this was the Giants, a couple weeks. I don't know how the Chargers look so bad today, but anyway, the Patriots doing a very good job of tanking, if you ask me.
Well, we got the Justin Herbert versus the Patriots game in which both of those sides can't lose. And obviously, Justin Herbert, not the problem there with the Chargers, but he does come through today. Before we exit the Arizona Cardinals, I did mention Trey McBride already, but I wanted to say 9 targets, 8 receptions, then the only pass that he does not catch. And not to say that he's going to catch every catchable pass as we go forward. These guys all drop balls. But the thing that is so crazy to me is the McBride has this elite speed that you don't see in the tight ends. You didn't see it in Rob Gronkowski, who was just a complete and total fantasy world breaker. You don't see it from Travis Kelce, who obviously is the same thing. I mean, Trey McBride has many, many years of Hall of Fame level play before he can be mentioned in the same category with those guys, but you love to see the speed. The other thing, though, is that he's a gigantic dude who, when the ball goes up, he catches it with 2 hands, and he looks like he's trying to squeeze the life out of the ball, which, again, you kind of like. The only pass that he doesn't catch today is on a touchdown that was flagrantly, blatantly, magically overturned because it obviously fit all the rules of a completed touchdown.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wrote in my notes a bizarre overturn because they called it a TD on the field. Well, they didn't know when they were discussing, and he was like yelling at the 2 officials, and it was like, I'm going to stuff you both in a locker if you don't give me this TD. And so they called it a TD on the field. But yeah, he had it. He had 3 steps down. You need 2 steps in a football move or a 3rd step. He had 3 steps down, and then the ball comes out as he's sort of going to the ground. You do not need to survive the ground anymore. That is not the rule anymore in the NFL. That's not a thing unless you haven't gotten your 2 steps yet. Then you do. If you're going to the ground, your 2 steps and your football move. If you're going to the ground, then sure, we can use that as shorthand. Like, yeah, you need to survive the ground. But it used to be way back in the Calvin Johnson days that, like, if you went to the ground, you had to survive the ground. That is not specifically said anymore. The ball does jar out when he lands on the ground. Like, after taking 3 steps going down, it was not close. I mean, the official in the booth did not believe it was close, and they overturned it. And then luckily, the very next play, Trey McBride's like, I'm getting my touchdown, and he scored on the very next play. But that is pretty hilarious. So what you're saying is he's not going to catch every single pass, although the only passes he doesn't catch in the stat book, he did really catch.
He did. So another great game from McBride. James Conner, I was hypothesizing a week ago that he might not even be rosterable in shallow leagues because of what Arizona faces down the stretch, and because if you're simply not good, you want to let some other players play. James Conner had a huge fantasy game today, so definitely not the case there. What's the next most interesting game on this week's slate, Ben? We had a Miami Dolphins Washington Commanders game where this one has all kinds of little silly pieces and kind of fun pieces where, I mean, Tua kept trying to throw long passes to Jalen Waddle, and Jalen Waddle's like, I don't understand why you're not just throwing them to Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
It's like,
I don't
my
want
teammate
this.
is so much better than I am. He also had just like an intermediate pass where I've been watching a lot of college volleyball. We're in the NCAA tournament for college volleyball, and it's a beautiful sport aesthetically, and the setting is absolutely gorgeous. Jalen Waddle got himself wide open after Tua scrambled around on one of these plays. Tua hits him in the chest, and Jalen Waddle took that ball, and if he had had a teammate to set it to for a spike, it would have been beautiful. Since his next actual action was to try and run forward for yards, that was not as helpful.
Yeah, is that the play where he just kept running and like went around the corner, and it was like everyone else stopped because the ball went to the ground, but he kept running and was like, look at how many extra yards after the catch I was going to get if I would have caught that. That was my favorite play.
Jalen.
I mean, he was obviously disappointed, but yeah,
he's been good in the past. He'll be good again. I don't know if there's ever been a situation where there were two good players on the same team where one of them is like, I'm going to have a greatest season of all time, and the other guy's like, I'm going to have the worst season of my career to support you, because we need to create all the incentives possible for Jalen Waddle to throw you the ball every single time. Tyreek Hill, multiple long touchdowns. He's absolutely unstoppable.
Yeah, but I mean, also this is Washington, so it was kind of
I didn't understand why they didn't wait a week to fire their defensive coordinator, because like obviously you're going to have that happen to you. Wouldn't you prefer to have it on the other guy's resume?
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. The new guy who takes over is like, with these cornerbacks, I got to try to stop Tyreek Hill. It was the movable. It was the unstoppable force meets the movable object in this one, right? So we got two long touchdowns. Devon Achane gets plenty of work, most of it late after Tua had actually come out of the game. Mike White takes over. He gets a rushing TD late. Had struggled a little bit with efficiency early on, but caught 3 early passes as well, and then had a short touchdown run a little bit earlier. And then in the late stages, looked really good, kind of running the game out, and scored on the final drive on a 4th down run with like a minute left. Like they didn't need to be scoring again, but they just wanted to get Achane another touchdown, which is, I mean, you like that. And if you want the guy in fantasy that his coach is like, yeah, we want to get you TDs with a minute left in the 4th quarter for no apparent reason.
Yeah, it was almost the case where they were trying to sort of subtly act like kicking a field goal would be unsportsmanlike, because that's like a guaranteed score. Whereas if you just hand it off up the middle, it's the defense's responsibility.
But they didn't hand it off at the middle. They did a pitch play. They're like, we're gonna pitch it out here to Devon Achane. Try and run him down.
You got to run your real offense. You don't want to send Devon Achane into the middle. I mean, if you switched universes here and you had Travis Etienne on the Dolphins and Devon Achane on the Jaguars, then Doug Peterson would run him into the wall. And Travis Etienne would be scoring 30 points a game.
But some people would just kneel there, you know. I mean, they were inside of 2 minutes after they scored the TD. Washington just ran the ball 3 times and ended the game. They were already up by 23. I'm not complaining.
Ben, if you've benched your quarterback, you've done all that is in your responsibility. No, the thing here that was encouraging is just, I mean, he can't be that. I mean, and it's somewhat obvious. With the 17 touches on the ground, 3 more receptions. I mean, you have this workload. That's not an issue, but especially if you're going to risk him in garbage time, he's pretty close to 100%, if not 100%. And It does make sense that they held him out last week, but that seems to be purely precautionary. It actually seems precautionary that they held him out of the game in which he got re-injured in. It seemed like he was more or less saying that was, again, not a huge deal. But as you point out very accurately a lot, especially for the good teams, it's about surviving the full season. The fact that their incentive in this game is to kind of get him back into a rhythm as opposed to protect him very, very positive for his chances in the fantasy playoffs. Ben, you and I had a team that finished in that 3-4 category in the FFPC that has to win twice to, well, the number one thing you want to do is win your league. And then obviously to get into the race, Achan was part of a route victory today. That was very, very exciting. Really, I mean, you and I are now in a situation where we're probably going to be either 2-1 or 3-0. My team with Colin Kelly, my OT co-host, won going away. That was exciting. The 2023 season has had some, ebbs and flows, but not only was it fun to get some really good games. I mean, today was the full mix again, where you've got like the 6-0 game as well. You've got the Falcons playing as well, all those kinds of things. But a lot of fun outcomes today. I feel very grateful to have been on mostly the winning side of it in the fantasy semis for FFPC, because got to win this week to win next week. Glad that the game where I was playing against Deebo Samuel, the rest of that team played poorly, and so it didn't beat me. At a certain point, you kind of put that game in the bag, and then you're like, well, how many points would Deebo Samuel score before it starts to get interesting again? It's like 40, 50, 70? Then in this game, too, we had obviously the rhetoric that the Commanders actually were going to try and run the ball to protect Sam Howell. They actually ran the ball pretty effectively with Brian Robinson, who unfortunately goes out. He looked fantastic again. He's put up some very interesting peripherals. I wrote about that last week on the Zero RB Universe. But then, as we know, running the ball does not actually protect your quarterback in any way, shape, or form. When you drop back to pass, you have to be able to do it successfully. A little bit of a frustrating game today. He doesn't get his normal volume. They let a free rusher go when he's throwing a quick screen, and that doesn't work very well when the guy is directly in the line of the pass. Can't really put that one on Howell. He gets another pick six, even though it's not his fault. Those add up in a way that I think do, weigh on the team in general. But we also did get from him the other little part of his profile that has been mildly disappointing this year. Hasn't been a huge problem per se, but he gets 2 rushing touchdowns today. Looked fantastic on both of them. Love to see him using his legs. Curtis Samuel has a good game. To me, Terry McLaurin, who puts up a 0 today, and that's a devastating score, obviously, if you have that in your lineup in a very key week. But also, you see some of the plays that Tyreek Hill made here, and it's not just about the 4.2 speed. I mean, the 4.2 speed is a huge, huge element to it, but he is adjusting to the ball well in the air and helping the QB out on some of these long passes. McLaurin had a chance to help Sam Howell today and just basically didn't make a good play on the ball. We've seen Jahan Dotson not make good plays on the ball. Curtis Samuel, actually the guy who is playing better than them in a handful of cases. He gets knocked out at the 6-inch line today, or else would have a touchdown on top of that line. It's nice to see him putting in that effort. Still feeling comfortable with your Sam Howell teams as we get ready to hopefully win $1 million with him. The Commanders will have the bye next week. And so in the fantasy finals, we'll have to go down to a lesser / maybe less heartburnish QB for the championship round.
Yeah, I'm still feeling all right. This is another team that, as I got destroyed, ended up running the ball more times than they threw. Only 23 passes. Some of that's because Howell runs 4 times and takes 3 sacks, but 28 rushes, 23 passes. They only get, 54 plays in total. 54, yeah. But yeah, typically we're going to see a lot more than 23 pass attempts. It was just a little tricky today, the way that Miami sort of dominated the first half, really. And they had the long touchdowns, but they also had a couple long. They had a 8-play field goal drive in the first half. They had an 11-play touchdown drive as well. And Washington also got a pick 6 in the first half. There's just several things that, it's kind of a weird game. I guess, why didn't Washington wind up with more pass attempts is sort of what I'm getting at. That last drive with Achan getting a lot of work was 7 minutes and 50 seconds, 13 plays. It kind of just wiped away the whole fourth quarter. They took over with 10 minutes left. and gave the ball back to the Commanders with under 2 minutes. The Commanders just ran 3 times and ended the game. They didn't get to run any fourth quarter plays, really. They only had 4 possessions in the end in the whole second half, and one of them was that final drive where they had the 3 rushes that I just mentioned. So just a low-volume game in total for the Commanders. Typically speaking, you expect to get a lot more dropbacks out of Howell, a lot more pass attempts, a lot more passing yards typically. Was disappointing, I think, in that regard here, because you knew Miami was going to be able to put some explosives on the board, and Washington was probably going to chase, and they're not even really competitive. And I guess the issue for me with Howell has been, and it's not a Howell thing, but it's one of those things where you worry that the team is going to bench the quarterback just because they want to do something, because they've had a lot of uncompetitive games. They've had a lot of blowout losses, and they've now lost 4 in a row and 6 of their last 7 as they go on the bye. I don't think they're going to bench him, at this point, or coming out of the bye or what have you. But I worry that when they get this far behind, I worried that today during the game that they might sit Howell down and make a change in game at some point, because they go, this game's lost, and we've lost all. They used to just throw into these deficits earlier in the year, like week 5. I'm looking at their game log here. Was the Bears game where they were down 27-3 or something like that at half, I want to say it was, and they just started throwing a ton in the second half. But they got beat 37-3 by the Bills. They got beat 45-10 by the Cowboys a couple weeks ago. Then this game with the Dolphins here. There've just been several games where they're just getting absolutely trounced.
And the pick 6 was a huge part of that. The pick 6 was a real dagger if you were playing people on either side of this game, which, obviously we have a lot of Tua going, have a lot of Waddle going, have plenty of Achane going. Certainly have, all of your teams where you're in the spot to draft Tyreek Hill in best ball, and you go ahead and draft him. And so, from that perspective, you're thinking even more points than the 5, 157, and 2. That pick 6 puts you in such a negative situation the whole rest of the game. Now, the cool part about it is that right after that, he does come back and lead a touchdown drive. Unfortunately, they immediately give up another touchdown and then give up the touchdown before the half that makes it 31-7. And so then it sets up for that dynamic you talked about. I mean, the second half, as you said, just didn't feature any possessions. They come out, they go touchdown, they go missed field goal, right? That's not offensive incompetency. And then you have a 3-and-out where Sam Howell only throws the ball once. It's like you got to call different plays. And then on the final drive, which they just handed off, I do believe Brissett was in. And, if that Miami drive ends 5 minutes earlier, then, Brissett might have been in it anyway. And so you do have some of those concerns. It's kind of this dynamic in fantasy where, and certainly with a team like the Kansas City Chiefs, for example, and, you have a team like the Buffalo Bills where when the defense starts to crumble, then you're almost excited about that because you're thinking now every game is going to be a shootout. The biggest problem with the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously, has been that their offense is just so much worse. But the defense also rising has created some of these dynamics where they're really leaning into Pacheco, even though mostly what that does is just siphon time from the game, which if you're trying to manage it from a reality perspective may make sense. If you are playing Mahomes and Kelsey and Rice and some of these guys, anytime that Andy Reid feels confident enough in his defense that he's going to lean into Pacheco, I mean, that's a huge cause for concern in fantasy. The Commanders are almost the extreme opposite example where their defense is just so bad that these games will get away from them. And when the defense is that bad, you don't have as much incentive in the fourth quarter. Your incentives do kind of shift to keeping people healthy. Obviously, the opponent can blitz you just relentlessly. And so it's not the best situation for Sam Howell and the Commanders. The fix is not to hand the ball off on first down. The fix is you've got to play better defense and you've got to call a little bit more aggressive passing plays. Today was one of the first games where the Commanders got very, very horizontal, except for some of the shot plays, which again, McLaurin has to make a better effort. You've got to believe that Jahan Dotson is going to be able to get down the field. Some of the things that the Commanders were doing there during that hot stretch when they stopped having such a massive sack issue, I feel like they've gotten too conservative with now. They're not managing the drives in the right way to be aggressive enough. And one of the things that was just so successful with them is they were passing enough for the passing to work. But now they're not doing that, and you're not getting, even though you still have the short passes, you have to be throwing the ball across the line of scrimmage. You've got to give guys like McLaurin and Dotson a chance to make plays. They never put those guys in the game other than on a handful of plays today. And I've been critical of McLaurin, but the main thing is just he's got to get more chances to show what he can do. Also, when you have players of that caliber, they can't be de-emphasized for Chris Rodriguez.
No, that would not be the preference. Shawn, the Eagles and 49ers, you mentioned Debo a couple of times. He takes a couple wide receiver screens to the house. That's right? He had, was it 2 different wide receiver screens?
And he gets an end around touchdown as well.
Yeah, I mean, just like everything was right around the line of scrimmage that he got the ball, and then he just housed it. I mean, it was so vintage Debo in that regard.
One of them is, it is across the line of scrimmage. It's kind of into the secondary, and then all the Philadelphia Eagles players decide to fall down.
Kind of weaved through the defense, yeah. The Eagles don't look great, although they have they don't in this game. They have had, this was, I think, I saw their 3rd game in 13 days. The Niners had 10 days off since Thanksgiving, if I'm not saying those things wrong, but there was a pretty significant rest advantage here for the 49ers, which was part of the reason the Niners were favored in this game, even though it was in Philadelphia. They're able to come in, get the win. The Eagles, of course, going through a stretch right now where they played games against Dallas, Kansas City, and Buffalo before the Niners, and then they get Dallas again. That is probably the hardest 5-game stretch any team's going to play this year, I think. They won the first 3 of those games. Lose here. They're going to Dallas next week. If Dallas can win that game, they will be tied atop the division, and it will cause a split in their head-to-head because Philly won the first matchup. So Dallas certainly needs to win it. If Philly's able to go into Dallas and win in Dallas, more or less decides the division. But now that Philadelphia has lost a game here, it could be next week. It could be tied at 10-3. So that would be interesting.
The Eagles' final stretch is very, very easy. So if they could get through that game, and even a team like the Eagles, when you play a stretch, as you just mentioned, you're going to have some down games. If they score touchdowns instead of field goals early, then it's a very different situation. But I mean, this is another game like the early situation with the Chiefs where the offense didn't look good. They're not getting the most out of these weapons. I would say on the Dallas side of things, there was nothing about what they did against the Seahawks that will defeat the narrative that most of their success this season, at least from the defensive side of the ball, has been preying on minor league football teams. But yeah, I mean, this game was all about the 49ers.
Yeah, I was just kind of building to saying that I'm not, worried about the Eagles in this, not writing them off, those types of things. They do get beat. And to your point, I mean, the Eagles take the 2 field goals early. They're up 6-0 after the first quarter. But from then on, the 49ers, every drive score a touchdown, if I'm not mistaken. They go 6 straight drives with TDs from the early part of the second quarter until the late part of the fourth, and then their final drive, they run out the clock. That was their final 7 drives. 6 touchdowns and end of game was the result of the final drive. They punted 2 3-and-outs to start. Didn't look particularly great early, but then just looked like the better team throughout. I'll be interested to see if these teams do match up again in the playoffs. If we see a little bit of a different level of maybe it's effort or rest or what have you for the Eagles defense. But to your point that, some of the Debo stuff, like some of the guys were just sort of not at the same speed as Debo, which he makes people look that way. But, it did look moving a little slow. You made the comment that they were falling down. But
and it's just a reminder of how good Debo is with the ball. Sometimes he gets a little bit of criticism because, he's one of the elite wide receivers who in some portions of the open score metric doesn't score as well. And it's easy to forget that I mean, he's a guy who's had a 99th percentile after the catch there. And then again, I would mention from Blair Andrews' work that it's the overall score that is the best indicator of future fantasy production. The other thing that was kind of interesting here, I was surprised early when the 49ers were struggling so much because the Eagles defense has not been very good this year. And that was another thing that just, I mean, I've been tracking that, and it's something that's fun to attack in some matchups because they're going to be shootouts. Obviously, the Eagles offense is going to score. But in reading Blair's wrong read, just the fantastic work that he does kind of, previewing the whole week on Friday, Saturday. Again, just coming into this game, the Eagles are not good in run defense. They're not good in pass defense. And as you mentioned, there were a lot of possessions in a row in this game where that was very much on display.
Yeah, so we get should have been an exciting game, turns into a bit of a thrashing. Sean, I mean, I'm like, what were the other fun games today?
There were a lot of fun individual performances.
Thursday was fun. I mean, Thursday night was the best Thursday night game we've gotten in a long time. What were some of the individual performances that you were thinking of when you said that?
Well, I've been a little bit, I don't think critical is exactly the right word, but when Tank Dell and Noah Brown look so good, and when CJ Stroud is having one of the greatest rookie seasons of all time, it's easy to look at the games that Nico Collins has played successfully and say that those are mostly just the product of situation. And yet with Dell getting knocked out of this game early, it was kind of a weird dynamic where at a certain point, especially if you're not playing him yourself or if you're directly playing against him, you're like, why is this Denver defense that has really been rising? Why are they leaving Nico Collins uncovered by 15, 20 yards? But I think you've got to give him credit for the big game today. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the tight ends. You get the huge game from Tyreek Hill. You get the big game from Puka. So definitely, if you have the right type of team, and certainly some players who have been league winners in one way, shape, or form, getting to this point, they do come through for their fantasy managers either in the FFPC semis or as you're pushing to make that best ball playoff, either in the FFPC or Underdog. Those guys did make the push for you again this week. I haven't watched the Colts Titans yet, but that obviously was a fun game with a lot of back and forth, and certainly for the Colts one that they needed to come through on. I do think that you're right, though, in that Thursday was the game that really got this weekend started in such an electric fashion. And, you and I had the discussion / debate, obviously not really a debate, but talking about CeeDee Lamb versus Tyreek Hill. Neither of those guys really left much question about, where they think they should be. But I don't think it's impossible that we get to drafts next season and those guys really are above Justin Jefferson. I mean, they've been one of the things we've gotten pushback against the idea that anybody other than Jefferson could be the top wide receiver. After these games for Lamb on Thursday night and for Tyreek Hill today, I mean, Justin Jefferson's got to really do something down the stretch here as the Miami.
Well, he's not going to play because Kevin O'Connell's just going to hold him out for the rest of the year. Got to protect him from himself, Sean.
Got to protect it. Yeah, that.
No, I'm just kidding. No, it's a good point. I think he's going to, though. I mean, so I was looking at. He's talked a little bit about wanting to be a Hall of Famer, this, that, the other thing. I mean, they held him out. He has a bye here. It's now been 8 weeks, 7 games, and a bye. But, Sean, he is at 571 yards through 5 games. Now, that was with Kirk Cousins. He's going to be in a completely different quarterback situation. But he will now have 5 more games. He's going to wind up with 10 games played, presuming that he's able to stay healthy and play the other 5 games in the back half, and he missed the 7 in between. in those 10 games, he would have to average more than 100 yards per game to have a 1,000-yard season. He is currently at 114 per game. I think he does it. I think he goes for over 1,000. I think
Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb are like, we would just need 2 more games to get to 1,000.
Yeah.
I mean, 5 games. What are you talking about?
Yeah. That Thursday night game was exciting. CeeDee Lamb 17 more targets. DK Metcalf goes off. JSN, though, ends up leading the team in targets. Has a clear, indisputable touchdown robbed from him by the mean officials. No, I mean, the ball obviously slid a little bit. You and I were talking before that I'm a slightly more on team that should have stood because, the ball does move, but he kind of has it pinned and doesn't really lose control, as they've talked about in some of these reviews in the past. And also because it took them 10 minutes to review it. I mean, if the play's got to stand at a certain point, especially when it's my fantasy player.
Right. I mean, you've got your watch on it. And there's an obvious time limit. If it's not 60 seconds, then it wasn't indisputable, right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
well, it's JSN. Yeah.
I mean, are we using indisputable or are we using get the correct call? Because get the correct call 10 minutes is not a problem. And
we're using my fantasy team needs the points. JSN's touchdown.
So one of the reasons that I think that people should trust me on Trey McBride's touchdown is I did not think that JSN kept the ball. The issue there, though, is that it's not completely clear if the point of the ball is in his palm the entire time or not. Because he has it completely locked in at the end of that. And after he's rolled around, but it's just, you can't. Anyway, Ben, what's the standard?
Still a breakout game. 11 targets, 7 catches. Looked good.
I always joke with
moves
my
after the catch.
Lawyer friends, especially the prosecutors. And they're, talking about their case. And I always want to know if they've proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt, because that always cracks them up. What's the standard again, Ben? Is it indisputable here because this play was ruled a touchdown? You were going to give actual information. Then we're going to play Geno Smith next week for the title because of the Joshua Dobbs benching. I hadn't had much enthusiasm for this until he torched the Dallas Cowboys defense. Also, I think we've been very accurate in fading DK Metcalf this year, but he looked fantastic in this game. And, all credit where it's due. The first touchdown, the long touchdown, was one of the best passes that you will ever see. The reason that Geno Smith is still in the league, just an incredible example of arm talent, accuracy. And then even at that point, it was impressive for Metcalf to have plucked that out of the air and then sprint the rest of the way for the touchdown. I would argue that the other touchdowns were a little bit, JSN putting him in position. But that first one, extraordinary 73-yard touchdown to start this game.
They should give the other 2 touchdowns to JSN, just because obviously he's the one who set them up. That was about all that happened in this game. Zach Charbonnet finally has a strong game. He's had a really brutal run out since he got an opportunity to play more with Kenneth Walker's injury. Been facing some really tough Ds, obviously, the last few weeks, but had a long reception here where he got loose for 39 yards, rushed for 60 more, not really running for much per carry in these last few games against these tough defenses, but did get a rushing TD here, 99 total yards. Good to see. I mean, the snap share's been awesome. When you have a backup that steps in and plays 80+% of the snaps, I mean, it's what you're hoping for with a handcuff, and it's been good to see. And you get all the pieces of the puzzle here a little bit, some receiving, some rushing, some goal line work. But yeah, not a ton else in this game. I mean, Dak has a really good come from behind game, throws for 303 TDs.
And really gets those 3 big weapons involved. I think you've got to be very excited about that. Brandon Cook's starting to make some noise deep on best ball benches. Tony Pollard, similar game to Charbonnet in that not really getting the dynamism you want, but you do get that touchdown. I mean, Prescott, doing everything he needs again. I mean, this was a shootout. This was NFL football the way it was, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Such a fun game.
Absolutely. Shawn, who's your MVP right now as we get ready to close it up? A couple weeks ago, you told me Patrick Mahomes shouldn't even be in the discussion. Jalen Hurts looks pretty bad today. Brock Purdy's numbers are through the roof. Everybody who is holding the 30-1, 50-1, 70-1 Brock Purdy long shots want Purdy to get more credit, although, I mean, we just got to talking about how both of Deebo Samuel's touchdowns, he had 116 yards and TDs, were just basically yards after the catch. I mean, not entirely, but more or less. Not to take away from Purdy, who plays a really good game in this game, but I mean, it is an offense, and you don't have, him adding anything with his legs, and it is an offense that is designed to add yards after the catch, and that's a big part of why there's a discrepancy between some of the, grading metrics and stuff like EPA. Like Purdy's EPA is always going to look really, really good. Some of that probably attributable to the offensive design. I mean, that's just where I'm at on it. I do think
George Kittle ends up not having a huge line today, but he was destroying the Eagles early. When you have that many options, you've got to play pretty poorly not to.
Yeah,
again,
honestly,
you can play poorly. I mean, a lot of the quarterbacks will and do, and he's been fantastic. But I mean, this is one of the most talented offenses of all time.
It truly is. I mean, we talked about this when he took over last year, but I mean, you have Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, and Brandon Ayuk has looked like a legitimate number one receiver. I mean,
Brandon Ayuk can't be covered, and yet he doesn't even draw targets because they don't need him.
George Kittle is top of his powers, elite, untackleable tight end. You have this
before they added these other guys around him. George Kittle was Travis Kelce.
Yeah, was Travis Kelce. You have Ayuk, who, if you didn't have all these guys, could probably be CeeDee Lamb. I mean, not quite probably, but like he looks like that good. Deebo Samuel, like the best hybrid receiver we've seen in this type of, like, he's in his own role. We say about anyone else who might be vaguely similar that they could maybe play the Deebo Samuel role, but the reality is he's just a unicorn. He's just doing things that don't make sense, but we're all just like calling it a Deebo Samuel role because he's redefined the whole position, wide back, whatever the hell they're calling it. And Christian McCaffrey's basically redefined the running back position. Or, we go back to the like Marshall Faulk comps. Like we got to go decades back, but these guys are incredible. I'm not trying to take too much away from Purdy, but I did want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, I think Purdy's definitely in the discussion. I don't know that I would call him the MVP right now, but I mean, there are still games we played. If he continues this the rest of the way, I mean, I suppose I could get behind that. But Dak is the one that I think is a little bit interesting as well, especially if they're able to beat the Eagles in the next game, pull to a tie. Usually you see the MVP come from, usually it's from the number 1 or number 2 seed in a conference. So definitely a division winner. The Cowboys won kind of knock, or Dak's one kind of knock because he's not even leading his division right now. But if they are able to pull even with the Eagles, and they're one of the best teams in the NFC in a really, a tough division with the Eagles, then I still think he could win it for a really strong regular season. Who would be your pick?
Well, Prescott has been fantastic, and I don't think that with how prolific he has been and how he's the guy pulling the trigger on this amazing season for CeeDee Lamb. You can't simply ignore that. And yet their schedule has been so unbelievably easy. And as a result, when you're talking about MVP, I mean, this, we're not selecting guys for an all-star game. You're talking about taking the very best player from the season. I think that he does need to win that Eagles game, and I think you need to win that division to be above Jalen Hurts. But Jalen Hurts probably not even, the other guy. I mean, it's going to sound hypocritical when I go to the guy that I do think can be in the mix for MVP because, he's also not going to get the number 1 seed in his conference. But you look at what CJ Stroud did today, where you lose Tank Dell early. You're playing just a completely resurrected Denver Broncos team that's on a big winning streak. And the Broncos actually lost to bad teams early and have been beating good teams recently. So their winning streak is very real. They run the ball 30 times and gain 3 yards per attempt. So this game was a little more similar to some of their losses where they leaned into their bad players more. I mean, Dameon Pierce carries 15 times for 41 yards in this game. The Denver Broncos defense actually gets to Stroud, and he takes 5 sacks today. And yet, because he's pulling the trigger, Nico Collins goes for almost 200 yards. And the Texans win a huge game for them to get to 7-5 and to be in that mix to not just make the playoffs, but potentially be in a position where you get an early game that you can win. And who knows what can happen at that point. And it was frustrating to watch them run the ball in this game because that was very ineffective. But you're also getting some good defensive play. Their defense, taking some of the mentality of their head coach. I mean, they came through in some big moments against Russell Wilson today, kind of seal that victory. This was a huge win for the Houston Texans. And even in a game that is not as gaudy as so many have been this season, Stroud does what it takes to get the victory. I'm going with him. And I think it's still very close with all of those guys, but I think he's been more impressive to me than Dak Prescott.
I'm going to go an even different direction. I'm going to say a guy earlier who we talked about earlier who had a ridiculous game, and you mentioned if they needed him to at all, would have probably just doubled it. I think Tyreek Hill should win the MVP. He's 5 catches, 157 yards, and 2 TDs in this game. He's going to go for 2,000 receiving yards. He is somehow unguardable for every single team and makes Miami's entire offense work. They're 9-3 now. I think it's time for a non-quarterback to win it. I think this is the season.
I don't know that his campaign contextually is going to be as dynamic and dominant as Cooper Kupp's from several years ago, but he's definitely in the mix. If I'm going to say that Cooper Kupp should have very clearly won in his best season, then Hill has to be there. If the best quarterback isn't going to be on the best team, but the wide receiver who sets new historical marks ends up being on a Dolphins team that takes the number 1 seed, which is a very real possibility, then it has to be him. So I like that selection as well.
157 today. He had 13 and 24 entering. That brings him to 1481. I think I have it at just about 1,500 yards already, Shawn, through 12 games, over 90 receptions through 12 games. It's not going to really build until, it's going to start building over these last 5 games because right now his line is 90 receptions, 1,500 yards, 12 touchdowns. But if he keeps putting up these lines, he's going to get to 130 and 2,000, right? And probably 16, and then you're going to – it's a lot of yards and touchdowns. And once you start to get to the size and the scope of those numbers, it's fascinating. You watch Miami, and if you took him off their team, that's the idea of the most valuable player, and it typically should be the quarterback. But if you took him off their team, he's their whole offense. Waddle has not been great. We love Waddle, but he has not been great. Raheem Mostert has been, and now obviously Achan's back, and they're doing some fun stuff. But those guys are A, running backs, B, building off of the threat of Tyreek Hill to some degree. You take Tyreek Hill off the field, they're not as effective running the ball. I mean, you'd like to think Waddle would step up, but this is not a deep skill position group, and he's the whole centerpiece of their offense.
And they are going to potentially have some more difficult opponents as we go down the stretch. The Jets in week 15 are very, very good. And at the same time, that's probably not going to be a shootout. The flip side of it is the case for 16, 17, 18, where Dallas, Baltimore, Buffalo, especially Dallas and Baltimore, they could give you some trouble. Although, again, Dallas getting shredded by Geno doesn't make you nearly as scared. But those games, shootout potential, it'll be interesting to see what those teams do. The Washington Commanders, sadly, are just not the kind of team where even if they had it in the game plan, is going to be able to take away a Tyreek Hill. Some of these other teams might be able to put together coverages and say, Jalen Waddle is going to have to beat us. We're willing to see if you can beat us with Mostert and Achane. Maybe you can with Achane.
We'll
I think
see,
that's going to be a lot of fun. I mean, there's a challenge here. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this and what you're saying is just like how much of the offense he is. One of the reasons I was going to kind of throw it out there, I mean, it's kind of silly, but if CeeDee Lamb goes for 200 next week against the Eagles, I mean, would you consider him as being in the mix? And partly, again, I mean, Prescott has put up more numbers outside of Waddle than Tua. I mean, Tua's numbers, when you look through his actual stat line, a little deflating when you think that, how is he not getting more when Tyreek Hill is getting that much?
Because Tyreek Hill's getting everything. Like, to your point, I bet there's a stat, like the percentage of, whatever, fantasy points, receiving yards. Of course there is. Market share stats. I'd be curious to know what his market share of receiving yards, his dominator rating is in this offense, because it's probably one of the better ones of all time in NFL history. But yeah, you talk about the Washington game. Yeah, the Washington's a team that can't stop him, but it's not even like he was running it up against them. He only had 5 catches. He averaged over 30 yards per catch. It was just like what you knew was going to happen. He did it, but it wasn't like Lamb today on Thursday night had 17 targets and 12 catches and then 116 yards or something. A lot of them were short passes, compiling a little bit. And I'm not dogging compiling because I'm a compiler, but I'm like a big fan of the compiling players, and I'm always talking them up. And I think that's such a massive part of playing sport of football is down to down consistency.
And the fact that Lamb has gotten to be that type of player after, being such not like a Marvin Mims. I mean, Mims doesn't get any volume at all, but to have built to where he can be a compiling type of player for Lamb is so cool. And to the point where he's so good that they gave him 2 carries for 30 yards in this last game.
But the difference,
and I've got to stop you really quickly and say that Jalen Waddle was the leading receiver for the Dolphins in 2 of the last 5 games. So maybe
the explosive plays when you know they're going to be there and you know that the whole offense is built around it and the whole defensive game plan. Look, there's never going to be the award is most valuable player. There's never going to be a more valuable player than the best quarterbacks. It's just the way that the sport is played. But in terms of a wide receiver and what they could actually reach, the pinnacle of what they could possibly reach, I mean, this guy is pretty valuable to every game that Miami plays.
Almost the only team that has stopped Tyreek Hill this year was the one team that traded him away and that desperately needed to make the point that that trade wasn't the worst thing of all time.
They're like, why isn't everyone else committing 5 players to stopping him?
It worked. They won that game. So, yeah, we will see. It's been a fun season because even with the very poor game in week 12, Lamar Jackson, at the very least, a dark horse candidate as well for that MVP. Ben, congratulations to your Washington Huskies. They came through when everyone doubted them. I had a fun time watching the Kansas Jayhawks defeat UConn at Allen Fieldhouse a couple nights ago. It's been a fun week of sports. It was a really exciting Sunday of fantasy. It was a decent Sunday of reality football. Some excellent games in there. We're rooting for everybody tomorrow as you try and get the final points. Then the thing I was mostly wanting to get done today was to win a couple of these key games before Travis Etienne steps on the field, which we have done. And it's such a huge relief not have to worry about that tomorrow, because I'm petrified about what the Jaguars might do there. We need Joe Mixon to score 10 or fewer points. Anyone who wants to root along with us won't be surprised to find that it's anti-Joe Mixon time. But such a fun week 13. Rooting for all of you tomorrow. Good luck to everybody. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch. Make sure you follow him at Yards Per Gretch. Check out Stealing Signals. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Lines. People are having a ton of fun with Stealing Signals Gold. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code there is RVRated 2023 at checkout. If you want to leave us a little Christmas present, the ratings and reviews help us a ton with the algorithm. We appreciate everything you guys have done for us there. We love you so much. We'll talk to you soon.